So hi everyone. Today we're having a staff discussion on the role that SALC is playing and can play or continue playing to try and dismantle the colonial legacy. So as you all know, we work in Southern Africa, and in Southern Africa, we actually haven't been that far removed from colonial times. Some countries obtained independence quite early on, like South Africa, but then it moved into apartheid, which was a whole different form of colonialization. But then other countries really only obtained independence in the 1960s. So Botswana, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, Angola and Mozambique only obtained independence in 1975. Zimbabwe was even later, 1980, and then Namibia only 1990. So we actually have a significant legacy of colonialism still influencing our economy, influencing levels of equality and equity, racism, all those sort of things, gender discrimination and other forms of discrimination. So we're really thinking about how, as an organization, we can try to work with not just litigating and advocating for equality and discrimination, but actively try to move our countries away from the sort of colonial dispensation and the colonial way of thinking. Because what happened was that colonial laws are really, having been in our countries for so many years and so many decades, it became normative. So there's many laws that people have accepted as okay and as acceptable and as an acceptable way of governing the country, but those laws are actually not in line with a constitutional democracy and with notions of human rights and those sort of things. So today we're going to discuss a bit about that. We're going to discuss sort of in our different areas of work where we think we can challenge the laws more, where we think we've done a good job in trying to set aside things and what some of the challenges are that remain, and really ask ourselves, how do we move away from the colonial mindset? What is it that we really want? So, for example, in most of our countries, when there's a crisis, our legislators respond by introducing criminal laws. So with COVID, immediately there's a ton of criminal laws, criminal offenses introduced through restrictions. So our countries respond to challenges using the criminal law. But we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of criminal law, and how far can and should we use criminal law to regulate social behavior, to regulate daily interactions people have? Can you use criminal laws to inhibit freedom of expression, which is what has happened in the colonial times and which laws still remain on our statute books today? So, and this is, I think, where we also need to discuss sort of freedom of expression. Under colonialism, freedom of expression was controlled. Some people could say stuff and other people's views were actively shut down and they weren't allowed to speak. So this wasn't just in relation to prohibiting people from criticizing the government. It was also prohibiting people from expressing themselves, whether they are persons with disabilities, whether they a gay, lesbian, or transgender person, a woman, a child. There were all those sort of inhibitions on what you can do, what you can say, what you can choose for yourself in your life, and those sort of things. So we're trying to work through all of those things, which means that we also end up challenging laws which are so ingrained in our society that people actually think that they're normal. So, for example, surveys within our region and in Africa actually find that many people find it acceptable for the state to limit speech and to prohibit publications from insulting the president and all those sort of things. So there's actually a general level of acceptance of prohibitions, of limitations on freedom of association. There's high levels of discrimination and intolerance to people who are other than yourself. And those levels of intolerance and discrimination definitely stem from colonial times, but they're very inherent in how we respond to society. So there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot of mindsets that need to change so that we escape what colonialism brought to our continent, which is basically discrimination, devaluing of people, distrust, and a sense that the law can be used to regulate people, to put them in corners, decide their daily lives for them. So this is what we're going to discuss today. It's all very exciting. We can also sort of veer off the actual legal discussions to other aspects of colonialism. I mean, colonialism has influenced, for example, how land is organized in our countries, and that has impacted on who has security of tenure and who doesn't have security of tenure, which deals with laws, but it also deals with broader ways in which resources are organized. Colonialism has allowed the extraction of natural resources with impunity and without colonialism. And today, those sort of companies continue to operate in a way very similar to what they did under colonialism, of coming into Africa, taking resources, and violating human rights and not feeling that they are accountable to the citizens of that country. So I'm opening up the floor. Amanda's going to chair. And I think just raise your hand, speak your piece about what sort of, when you heard we're going to have a discussion on colonial laws and what SALC is doing and can do, what sort of came to mind? If someone's brave enough to start, that would be great.
I think I can jump in, Anneke, to sort of piggyback on what you've said. I think that it's an extremely important discussion that we're having. Like you already said, a lot of citizens in different countries that are colonized just think certain things are the norm without actually having looked at the history of why these laws were actually put in place. And we see a lot of the time some of these colonial laws were put in place to sort of to regulate labor, because the what happened is that you find that either the British or the Portuguese or whoever may be, when the colonialists came into different countries, then they were using the people who are actually in those particular countries, or the original people. There's a word. What is the word?
Indigenous.
Indigenous. Yes. They were using the indigenous people for cheap labor and so forth, and then they would require them to sort of try and be able to be in control. They came up with all these laws, like we see the vagrancy laws, and we see how, at least with SALC, we are tackling this through the petty offences campaign, and Chikondi can speak a lot more to that because that's her cluster. And so also, even with regards to issues like LGBTI rights, we also see that those were also put in place to sort of control human interaction and human behavior. And the irony of it all is that that prior to colonialists coming into these countries, we found that homosexuality was actually something that was not an issue in African countries. And now we find that the Europeans, through the different mechanisms that they have set up after having gone back to their separate countries, are now coming and telling us, actually, no, you need to change your laws. After, as Africans, we were socialized and indoctrinated that, for instance, homosexuality is wrong. And then have gone back and now they're saying, actually, it's right. And now we have to reverse all the damage that was done. So that's just one of the examples, and hence the reason I think it's an extremely important topic. And the last thing maybe I'll add before I give the floor to someone else is that a lot of these laws were put in place, and then after the fact, you get your things like your Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And now we're sitting in a place where we have contradictory laws to the almost the biblical human law state, which being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we see the contrast, and we see that what actually happened is they came in and dug up a whole mess and left us, and now are leaving us to clean it up. And we are, of course, as the Southern Africa Litigation Centre, working towards reversing some of these laws bit by bit, because you can only eat an elephant one bite at a time. That is an African proverb. So being said, I'm happy to open up the floor to anyone else who has something to add. I think Attila looks quite excited, and so I'm just gonna hand over the baton to you.
I think Tambu has a hand raised. So
who's that?
Tambu.
Tambu. Oh, sorry, Tambu. I didn't see your hand. And then Brig after Tambu.
I thought you were exercising your power as chair. Okay, so to pick up from what Amanda was saying, I think a lot of our laws and our norms, so to speak, have come from, the culture of the colonialists. So a lot of things that we call our African culture, like issues like modesty, or whatever that word means, it's not actually African culture. It's, for most of Southern African countries, British culture. So, for example, you have laws that criminalize so-called indecency, like indecent exposure. You have laws that are applied in some of our countries. Other countries have little bit by bit made it a little less of an issue, like dressing. In Zambia, there was a case where a young girl was arrested because she was wearing something that was considered to be too short. But if you go back into so-called African times, the dressing was not an issue. If you really want to see the traditional rituals that are done in Eswatini, the Zulu state, women have no problems with dressing in a certain way, and it does not have sexual connotations at all. But because the colonialists came and said you must dress in this way, and this way is proper, and we got used to that for so long, we now believe that it is our culture, and that indecent dressing means short skirts, and decent dressing means long skirts. And that's something that has also then crept into our laws. There's need for us to have a complete mind shift when it comes to things like these. In addition, you have offenses like insulting the modesty of a woman. And these offenses are ostensibly put for purposes of protecting women, but they are used actually to restrict women from going into public spaces. They're used to restrict women from speaking in certain ways, like a case that we filed in Malawi. An activist was arrested because she had said certain words that sound vulgar in vernacular. And she was arrested for insulting the modesty of a woman. Not clear which woman she was insulting when she was a woman herself. And the problem with that kind of law is that it's used in many, many, many different circumstances. It's used when, the situations of people being stripped in public, which is a very serious thing. But the fact that that serious situation and a situation like Beatrice's case attract the same kind of offense or the same kind of law makes it very difficult even for any activism to deal with issues of sexual assault against women and against vulnerable communities. So that's one of the colonial legacies that we have to deal with and that needs to go.
Thanks so much, Thabo, for that valuable input. 100% agree with you. Can I hand over to you, Brig?
Thank you, Amanda. I want to just go back and connect from where Anneke and yourself, Amanda, touched, especially where Anneke talked about the praxis, that some of the things that were done during the colonial era have actually continued happening. And Amanda, you touched on labor as Africa, those indigenous people providing cheap labor. It's so very interesting, especially in the economic and social cluster where we work in, because in many countries I've consulted and looked at the development which is being done, especially when people are seeking land from rural communities. One core issue that they bring up is they are going to provide employment. I've never looked at any development project where it's not flagged that we are going to bring employment. So it is still being used just like it was used during the colonial era. And it's just amazing that you have a rural community, a family that has their own land. They are cultivating enough food for the family. There could be even 20 of them. They don't go hungry. They are eating 3 meals in a day. They have water nearby. They have no problem. They have even surplus resources from whatever they grow to sell and even send their children to school. Now they are being deceived to surrender all that resources that they have in exchange for employment, to work as farm laborers, being paid what is not even enough to sustain one person. Not even just for medical expenses, for example. Forget about this education expenses of the children. It doesn't get there. Worse, most of the investment that's happening, especially if you're looking at agriculture investment, they are using machines. They only employ drivers. For poor women, for example, they only perform seasonal jobs, picking what is left by a combined harvester. So if you are going to talk about even employment, you are talking about maybe 3 months employment in a year, but someone has to surrender the resources they have. So I just wanted to touch on that because it's a practice which is being used by the people who are coming to invest in. Almost all the countries have been involved in the region. They use employment as the topmost before they talk about either building schools and stuff like. Now, going back to, again, the economic and social rights, looking at them from land, labor, water, health, education. I'll pick on land, which Anneke touched. Not that it's the most important, but I think because these rights are interlinked. So as Anneke mentioned, most of the tenure regime we have across Southern Africa in the SADC region, they have their origin from the colonial era. At that time, depending on the colonizer, you either had what they would call crown land, if you're talking about those that were governed by the British, and then the reserves, native reserves for the rural community. They were removed from the land they were originally occupying in many cases and shunted in these areas which were called reserves or native reserves or trust lands, some form of social segregation. Boundaries were drawn at that time for those categories of land, including traditional authorities. So in many countries I've been consulting, the boundaries that were left during the colonial, they are the boundaries that are still existing now. The whole system of land tenure, which was designed during the pre-colonial or the colonial era, was designed to allow the colonizers to extract resources and also for social control of the people that were there. Cheap labor, like Amanda mentioned, was one of, when they don't have land, what else do? They provide cheaper labor to a nearby farm. But at independence, unfortunately, the land tenures never changed, and so are the institutions. So what you have now is maybe you have what they call customary land in some countries. You have what they call communal land in some countries, within neighboring statutes, Communal Land Act, tribal land, which was the customary, and then you have freehold, leasehold, which was the one which were maybe crown land. So that system has remained. And the security, as Anneke mentioned, which was attached to the crown land or the one for the etc., remains supported by the Deeds and Registry Act, depending on which country you are, because they have those mechanisms for registering. And then you have the one for the customary, the tribal, which is weak, you can't tell that is weak because in there we have had a lot of amendments. We have tribal acts, we have communal land acts, and what have those acts done? If you look at them, they have even further reduced the power that community had over land. And that's why now you are hearing in many countries that, well, there is a presidential decree, they have taken over customary or communal land, or there was an act of parliament which vested land which was in the tribe now to maybe a board, a land board, a community, a committee of some kind, or a local authority. So the tenure system, as it was weak during the colonial period, it has even worsened after, because they have maintained the same system, the same administration system for land governance, except they have changed. I would say some kind of cosmetic change, but not really much has changed. So often when I go in trying to work on in another country or consult, I try to look at what is the land tenure, and it's so fascinating. There is nothing, most of it is pre-colonial. You are either in a common law jurisdiction, you are applying English common law for the majority of land issues. It's not in a registration or an act of parliament. Most of it, the rules that govern, the principles are either common law, British common law, or you are dealing with Roman Dutch common law. It's one and the same. Those rules come from the colonial period. That's what we have. But then the effect of this poor land tenure rights, especially for those occupying the communal land, the tribal land, or the customary land, is that those rights can actually be extinguished so very easily, and with repercussions that are so horrible for the people. So you have investors, for example, going after customary land because it's considered to be cheap. At times it's considered, though it's not even owned by someone, because that's how it was even pre-colonial. And then when the people have displaced, the negative impacts on the children, the elderly, the disabled, just generally everyone is just so disproportionate. And if you're going to look at women, it's just a sad reality. And these are the things that we are trying to do in the social and economic cluster to strengthen the rights of these rural communities so that they can retain what is lawfully theirs. Now, where development is required, because of course we do need development, let it be done in a manner that is consistent with the human rights, that respects the national constitutions, regional laws and mechanisms, and international law, in so that development does not leave anyone behind. As things stand now, due to the same practice of the colonial, we have continued with the segregation. We have poor communities in the rural areas who are even becoming much worse. They are being subjected to extreme poverty because they cannot access the land that they depend on as a resource or a source of livelihood. So this is basically what I would just add. I'll be happy to add much more as we continue discussing.
Thank you so much, Brig, and you're 100% right. Whilst you were talking, I thought about some of the acts that in these countries and SADC, and some of them date as far back as like the 1940s and 1950s, and we see that at no point have governments then thought to re-look at those acts and customize them to the current day and, you know, outside of colonial time. So thanks for raising those important issues. I know, Anna, you also had your hand up.
Thank you, Amanda. And I just wanted to piggyback on what Amanda said about, is my internet okay? Okay, so what Amanda said about the laws against the homosexuality or same-sex activities being, brought by the colonialists and imposed on the African continent without any consultation whatsoever. That undemocratic lifting of the European laws that we see even now, like Anneke said, a lot of them are still there. We have, even as the African continent, see those laws as part of our culture. We hear a lot of people saying homosexuality is not, it's an African, it's not part of our culture. So that kind of intolerance that's been brought by the European laws, it's ingrained in our culture such that is the norm. It's seen as culture. It's seen as normal. But also, in addition, one of the things that the colonialists used as a tool to sort of shape communities in Africa's behavior, to segregate and impose that intolerance, is religion. One of the things where homosexual people are described as sinful, abomination, evil. We hear quite a lot of that, such that in the Botswana decriminalization judgment, the judges had to spend a lot of time explaining the story behind Sodom and Gomorrah, because religion is has played a key role in segregating people and assigning them, levels in society of being evil, immoral, and abomination. That's one tool, which is why SALC is doing a lot of work around religion, engagements with religious communities around the issue. And it's not just religion on its own. Another tool that the colonialists use is the army, the police, and they were used and still are used to, to ingrain those European moral standards of how society should look like, who should have sex with who, and policing the privacy of individuals and people, and invading their privacy. That has resulted in people being punished, people being arrested because of who they are, or being bribed or being ridiculed. As a result, that whole state structures, are structured according to how colonialists, have brought their tools into the African society, including, of course, the medical theories. Some time ago, it's changed quite a lot, but there were medical theories where, it was actually in the books that being homosexuality is a disease, being trans is some kind of mental problem. So all these things have been used to define homosexuality, same-sex, and to reject people who identify as LGBT, and the state structures are used to police and punish as a result. So there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done around those religious theories, because they define the law quite a lot. In a lot of African laws are defined based on the religion and morality. Some years ago, when the government refused to register Lekhabibo, one of the reasons that we used is that the organization will disturb public peace and morality. And those are the standards set through the religious aspect. And I'm glad that the judiciary, as it evolves, they're able to really see these statutes as very oppressive, as degrading of dignity and intolerant of people being different, or people who they are, and policing privacy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks also for raising the issue of religion. I know it's a very controversial one, but but nonetheless, it is worth mentioning. And even just while we're speaking, I was thinking about before the colonialists came into African countries, we found that Africans had their own manner of interpreting religion, and we were then told that this is in fact witchcraft, and you cannot use herbs, and you cannot burn mpupe and incense and so forth. And now, after the fact, it's only at this stage we see that Africans are slowly starting to go back to that which they knew right from the beginning. So religion is probably a podcast for another day. So I don't want to start that debate, but I think it is good that you did raise it. I don't know. I see Chikondi has her hand up. Let me hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. For me, I will start from where Anneke left. You know, when we were talking about the COVID regulations, the criminalization of non-compliance with COVID regulations across the region, I was just thinking there that like 10 years to come or 20 years to come, if we still have these regulations, or 40 years to come, the generation then, what are they going to call them? Are we going to call them colonial laws? So I feel like it's more, there's more to it than just being colonial. I think it's also an issue of power interplay. I feel like these laws, they work out for those that are in power. We try as a society to find an easy way out to problems, and I guess over the years it's been criminalization of any conduct that we want to control, and it's evident from what we are seeing now, because most countries have opted to use criminal law as a way of trying to control people so that they comply with the COVID regulations. So even the failure to deal with the laws that we adopted from our colonial masters is still an issue of power, because if you look at the Mmolai-Chalmers judgment, where the courts were very clear in terms of the laws that are still in force now in terms of petty offences, that the court made a clear order to say Parliament should actually review these laws, and that was 2017. Up to now, no one cares. You know, the meeting that we had with the members of Parliament and the law commissioner. The law commission under the constitution and within the law commission act, they are empowered to review laws that are not consistent with the constitution. It's very clear there. So there they have a judgment, and in the meeting they said you should write us an email. You should write us a letter. I'm like, yeah, but this is your duty under law. You're supposed to review laws that are not consistent. So it's an issue of saying, if this doesn't concern us, or if it's working for us, then let's leave it there. Because our authorities, our leaders, they found these laws very useful. We can see even after the Mmolai-Chalmers, the police have now stopped using the rogue and vagabond offences. Now they have opted for idle and disorder, which they were not using before, and they're doing so because it's working for them. You know, so I feel like it's an issue of politics that we also need to think of political solutions to these problems. And what comes to my mind is how we made the advocacy we did around the HIV bill. You know, how we got the MPs involved throughout the process when we're advocating for the controversial sections to be removed from the bill. It had to take the same politicians to speak to each other and say, no, we cannot pass this law with these provisions. So I think our approach probably shouldn't just look at, okay, we adopted these laws from our colonial masters, they are bad laws, but how do we engage with the system and the way it operates? Because as long as these laws are not affecting those that are in authority, they will still be there. You know, as long as they work for them, the laws will still be there. And also, just to mention some of the laws that probably haven't been highlighted, but they still impact on various vulnerable groups. Like in the Immigration Act in Malawi has a section that provides for prohibited immigrants, and you can see clearly from that particular section that it criminalizes poverty, it criminalizes, it discriminates people on the basis of disability. It also criminalizes sex workers, homosexuals, and this law, of course, now the Immigration Act is under review, but you see that there's nothing that has been done, probably because those that are in power cannot be affected by it, but it's an issue of also raising out these issues and bringing them out on the table, because when we look at one certain area, then we forget that there are also some other pertinent laws that are also infringing on other groups of people. Yeah. That's it, Amanda.
You're muted.
Here I am talking to myself. Thanks so much, Chikondi. Thanks for highlighting the issue more, especially around it being a power play and politics, because you're 100% right. I mean, like Anneke mentioned earlier with regards to COVID, we saw how immediately we just got this overhaul of criminal laws that were put in place. And as much as one can complain about the colonialists, we also see how the current governments in play are using the same tactics now on their very own people, which is very interesting to see. I mean, we didn't have internet, obviously, in the 1920s or whenever they were around. But look, now we've got this whole internet shutdown in Swaziland, which we can also look that it's also happened previously in other countries, I think in Zambia and Tanzania, and so forth, in Zimbabwe as well. So we're seeing how they're still using these sort of this power play and using their powers and treating them into the laws in order to control citizens. So it's true, we do need to look at it from a political perspective. Thanks so much for that, Chikondi. Attila, I saw that your hand was up earlier.
Oh, yeah. I'll keep my remarks short to give enough space for discussion. What comes to mind in my cluster, which is the International Criminal Justice Cluster, are the international crimes and human rights violations that have been committed by colonial powers and the huge impunity that is there. And more importantly, I think how these former colonial powers are tackling the issue of accountability. I mean, obviously the law was used in those times to cover up violence and injustice. And most of these injustices or violations would be today considered as international crimes or grave human rights violations. And it's very interesting to see how states actually, like, even if more than 100 years have passed after those crimes have been committed, how cautious states are still behaving. I mean, one very good example is, I think, the example of Namibia and the genocide by Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, and how actually Germany is behaving or tackling the accountability issue there. Because I think only recently Germany officially apologized for genocide of the Ovaherero and Nama people in Namibia. And even then, even in that statement, for instance, Germany is avoiding actually terminologies like reparation, just so that there shouldn't be like anyone should come up with the idea that of compensation claims or like that Germany is legally accountable for what happened. I mean, and we're talking about crimes from 1904 to 1908, I think. So it's more than 100 years ago, and states like Germany are still behaving in this manner. And it really questions their dedication to accountability if they are calling nowadays to hold individuals or other states to account, and but still walking on eggshells when it comes to their own conduct 100 years ago. So I think that's an issue that should be raised.
Thanks so much, Attila. 100% I agree with you. And just while you're speaking on the issue of accountability, it just reminded me the other cluster or the portfolio we deal with being business and human rights. And when we think about the mining industry, and I think Anneke touched on this initially, we see how even to date, funny enough, a lot of the royalties are still being paid to these countries outside. So even though you find like your DRC, which is one of the, they have so many uses in terms of mining. Unfortunately, they still have to pay a lot of these monies to Belgium and to France and to so forth. And this is happening in so many other countries as well when it comes to the business and human rights sector. And we see how, Briggs spoke extensively around this, even the labor that is being used, unfortunately, is very cheap labor, yet we are paying a lot of money to European countries for documents that were signed hundreds of years ago that have made us, or put African countries sort of in a position where they owe the colonialists. So thanks for raising that very important point. Anneke, I don't know if you want to jump back in and share some of your thoughts.
Yes, I would like to hear from our interns as well, since we do have them on the call and we don't often hear from them or see them. I think some important things have been raised around policing and around power. And the ways in which policing is being used now is very similar to how policing have been used in the colonial times. And Chikondi is absolutely right that it is a deliberate thing, that for example, with the COVID regulations, when states of emergency and states of disasters were declared in all our countries, suddenly the police acted with impunity, and they were only able to do so not because of the nature of the regulations, because they're still bound by the Constitution, but because of age-old practices of thinking that if there's some state of disaster or emergency, then anything counts, and the police and security agencies and the army can do whatever they want to. And we knew that this would happen. We knew that our police haven't changed enough for them to behave in an ethical and human rights respecting way when we unleash them on the community to police COVID restrictions. And yet we continue to do that with very little sort of efforts by government to actually deal with it. I mean, some governments actually say, should people arrest people who don't wear masks, or, you know, like you have the right to do whatever you want. In Eswatini, the government was saying, should to kill the protesters this past week. You know, like there's things being said, and police and armies are being encouraged to violate human rights, which clearly show that the executive, the state and the powers to be don't see the police and the army as people who are still accountable to the Constitution, but they rather see them as an arm of themselves who are there to implement what they ask them to implement, which is why things always get more repressive when there are protests, when there's opposition to government, when there's elections or any sort of crisis. So we've actually not moved at all in terms of how we respond to those sort of things. There's actually still very little acceptance of free expression, acceptance of criticism, which is why you see throughout the region people being arrested for causing disaffection, meaning they criticized whatever the president or the king or the government said. And these are all outdated laws. These sedition laws come from the 1930s. Many countries have already let go of it because they're so archaic, because they aren't in tune with freedom of expression. But in our region, in SADC, they are very much used and loved by those in power to sort of, because it's a catch-all. I mean, no one can say what disaffecting, causing disaffection means. So it's like a lovely offense because you can literally arrest anyone for anything. So people have been arrested for making a joke on Facebook about a president, you know, like those sort of very innocent things. So there's a lot that needs to be done. Let's pass it on to our interns for very brief comments, just to hear sort of what you've thought about the discussion so far and if you have anything to add.
Thanks, Anneke, and thanks for those points. And it's really, especially with freedom of expression, it's really good it's really getting right what governments are allowing. As I know we're doing impossible to sort of to see how we can infiltrate this. So that being said, Colton, you look like you have so much that you want to share with us.
I don't think I have too much to add. On the discussion so far with the theme of social control and the law and these colonial legacies being used to control people, I was struck in the research I was doing on papers, which you mentioned, how these kind of legacies of colonial practices of not respecting customary land rights, seizing land, can be used to make communities easier to control by removing the ability to be self-sufficient and support themselves, and instead converting that land into structured farms that actually remove their own ability to support themselves instead of make them dependent on investors or government farm plots, that they use these colonial land rights structures to reinforce that practice of trying to control populations themselves.
100%. Thank you so much for sharing that, Colton, and I agree with you. I don't know, Iva, if I can pass the baton over to you.
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I was struggling to hear you a little bit, Colton. But yeah, Iva can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. First of all, it's been really great to hear from everyone and to learn about this topic from so many different perspectives. It's been very enlightening. I don't have too much to add. I guess just from my perspective of the work I've done so far for SALC, what really has struck me were the issues of paternalism and control, really. Something that Tae and I have worked on is related to rape laws in a lot of countries. And so something that's really stood out to me is control, particularly over women's bodies and women's autonomy. In the way that a lot of these laws were written was meant to protect women, but really what happens, as we've discussed, is a lack of control being taken away, criminalization of adolescent sexuality, for example. And so that's just been something that's struck me.
Thank you so much for raising those points, Iva. And you 100% correct, and Thabo also touched on that, the issue. I mean, a good example is in Eswatini with the reed dance that Brig has been trying to get to for a number of years. And we know that that is a practice that has been ongoing for years and years and years. And now it sort of looks like it's something that, even though, Europeans and a lot of people come and want to see, but at the same time, one does speak about the bodily integrity of a woman and is it right, and it's now being questioned. And so thanks for raising that. Tae, what are your thoughts, if any, around this particular topic?
Yeah, I can't hear you, Tae.
Or is it my network? Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Sorry, I don't have anything new to add, but I wanted to say how struck I was by what Chikondi said about how will people 20 years from now discuss the laws around COVID, and how can you call them colonial legacy laws when this is something new? So what my thought process has always been about colonial legacy is that it was mostly around providing a platform for power, and that's how countries have just moved on from there. And I don't know if I'm trying to say what I'm trying to say is coming across correctly, but what Chikondi was saying about how it's passed on the baton of power from colonial powers to the to these new governments, it's kind of intense, and it's really interesting to see how they use prior practices in their current law, their current legal system, and how it's not just a legal framework, it's a political framework, it's an institutional framework. It's so ingrained in African society now that it's hard to take it apart. But SALC has been doing amazing things in every aspect of social life to kind of take it apart.
Thank you so much, Tae. Thank you for that insightful addition. And maybe I can hand over the baton to Thabo before we round up.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So some of these things I've known about, but I didn't necessarily know that they come from colonialism. I think Tambuzai is the one who actually highlighted it in terms of women and dressing, all that stuff. You know, in African culture, you see it. You grow up with it. It's nothing new. But when the older you grow up, you hear people saying, no, you don't dress, a woman doesn't dress a particular way. You dress this type of way, you know? And it's ingrained in us. It's ingrained in us to the extent that I think a couple of years back in varsity, we were talking about decolonization and all of that stuff around fees must fall. None of that came across because some of these laws fly under the radar, right? You look at some of the bylaws that Johannesburg has. It in a sense criminalizes being homeless and being a beggar, right? And unfortunately, no one says anything about these things because we are not affected. And in essence, it gives police the right to say, I can harass a homeless person, I can harass a beggar because I'm doing it under the ambits of the law. And for me, that is something that I think is something that we should definitely take a look at. And as a last point, I read somewhere while still searching about doing research for this, that in 1947, I think, Kenya proposed the law that said if you were an African and you were unemployed for 3 months, you were liable to be sent to prison. And that is another way that colonialists, in a sense, enforced that they had manual labor, you know, because you weren't, as a Black person, you weren't allowed to have your own land. You weren't allowed to have your own informal business. So the only way of employment was to go to these white areas, to go to these white businesses and say, hey, can you give me a job, right? And that also increased in exploitation, which is something that still happens now, unfortunately. We live in a democratic era where most African countries say we are a democracy, but some of these things are still there. Some of these things are still affecting a lot of the population. But yeah, the people in power are still saying, we are good.
Thank you, Thabo. Can I pop in here? I think you raise a very important issue, even on the fees must fall and those sort of discussions and the broader colonial discussions about the education system. But that aside, I want to respond to two things. Thabo, when you said I think you made an important point when you said that when there are laws that discriminate against people who are poor or people who live on the streets or people who beg, no one says anything because it doesn't affect them. And there's a lot of research that's been done about why have we retained the laws that we have. And the truth is it suits us. It suits many people in middle class positions. For example, if you trained as a lawyer, And you did notary documents, and you trained how to do conveyancing, and you trained on certain divorce procedures. Now you've spent all your time training on the current system of law. You don't actually want it to change. You're quite happy with the current system of law. You're earning an income. So in many different ways, people are actually keeping things in place. That's why, for example, in the legal profession itself, there's such a strong backlash against paralegalism, because lawyers are in it for the money, often, apart now from the people on this Zoom call. And for them, it is not necessarily about access to justice, because justice requires that everyone should be able to access the courts, that you shouldn't have to pay high legal fees to be able to assert your justice and those sort of things. So there's a lot that we actually do need to work on making the law more accessible where it does protect rights, because sometimes there's good laws, but no one can access it. No one can access the courts to assert their rights because of how the legal profession works and how accessible it is. There's also an issue linked to that about no one saying anything about power and about the fallacies of a parliamentary government. And this might be another discussion, like the religious discussion, for another day, but as soon as people are elected into power, they also actually sometimes adopt a different lifestyle, start seeing life differently. And you often find then that people who are parliamentarians are not directly accountable to their constituency. And even if they are, their constituency might be people who live in poor areas, but it wouldn't be the most marginalized within that poor area. People with disabilities, people who are gay, people who live on the streets, children who live on the streets, it wouldn't be those people. So even if they are accountable to their constituency, the voices of the most marginalized in society will never be heard through our current system, which is why the laws that affect them most are also never raised. So, for example, Malawi had like a 10-year process to reform their penal code. And there were like tons of submissions on what should be reformed and all those sort of things. Not a single submission on the vagrancy laws, the idle and disorderly laws, the rogue and vagabond laws. In fact, the Law Commission didn't even look at that section of the penal code because it didn't think there was an issue, even though that is a part of the penal code most often used to violate human rights of the most marginalized within Malawi. So it shows the issue of public participation and why what we do when we support civil society organizations to make submissions to Parliament is so important, because there's a big gap there in making sure that the needs of the most marginalized in society are actually raised in Parliament. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to just raise around customary laws is that there's a myth about customary laws, and the same applies in many different ways. So, for example, Anna explained the myth around attitudes toward homosexuality, where current African governments would say, don't talk to us about the rights of people who are gay and lesbian because that's a foreign concept. When actually what is a foreign concept is the intolerance towards people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's a myth, and we need to break down that myth. Another myth is one around customary laws themselves, and that they are oppressive towards women. There are many communities, and Brigadier can speak on this, where actually women are in leadership positions within those communities. And it's often those communities that are most attacked by governments to take away their land and their security and their resources. In our case before the Court of Appeal in Botswana, SALC actually, on the Musi versus Ramantele case, we actually made a very interesting argument where women were not allowed to inherit, and the people who sought to deprive them of their inheritance argued that it's based on customary law. And we actually went back in history showing sort of records of how women were able to inherit in the 1920s. They were able to inherit in the 1930s because then inheritance was based on the rules of justice, of equity, and those fairness. And it was only when colonial powers got people to actually write up the customary laws, that those customary laws then became rigid, and they became solely in favor of men. So, and there's a lot there as well about how colonialism brought in discrimination against women in the workplace, against women in leadership positions, in many, many different ways that we often don't even think about. But the myth is that actually what we need to address is customary law, because that's where the discrimination lies. And it's actually far more complex than that. I'll leave it at that, sorry.
Thanks so much, Anneke, and you raise extremely important points. I mean, I know how passionate you are about petty offenses, and and 100% the issue of colonial laws does really, it's clear when we look at this entire campaign that SALC is part of petty offenses, because we see, and Thabo raised some really, really interesting point. Thabo, when you were speaking, I felt like clicking my fingers because you were on fire. And you really raised some really important issues about how this affects the people who cannot speak for themselves, the poor and the most vulnerable. And as the middle class, we sort of caught in between, as Anneke said, well, as lawyers, we sort of making the money, and so we want the laws to remain. And then you've got the guys at the top who are looking for power, and then all we left is with the most vulnerable right at the bottom, which is really, really sad. So thanks for raising those really important points. Tambo, I see that your hand is up.
Thank you, Amanda. I wanted to agree with everybody, which is very unlikely with lawyers. But I wanted to say, in line with what Chikondi said and everybody else, the issue of power, and to link it with, the colonial legacy. Briggs spoke about how customary land, how customary land laws tended to take away people's right to self-sufficiency. And I would say that in the current dispensation, so to speak, you have issues like vending being criminalized. And a lot of our petty offenses target people that are in the marketplace that don't have licenses or whatever it is that they're required to have. And you find that getting licenses is usually a preserve of those that are in so-called formal business. And your vendor at the corner who sells tomatoes will probably not be able to afford a license. And at the end of the day, everybody has to go and get a job working for someone. And you will not be able to take care of your family. And we then link that up with a lot of our laws that have been put in place, laws and regulations that have been put in place ostensibly to control movement of people in the COVID-19 era. And a lot of them kind of don't take into account that a lot of people survive from vending, from being in the marketplace. And you then have situations where there are lockdowns and you're supposed to be confined to your home. But if the way you survive and if the way you feed your family is by being in the marketplace, then the government then has the obligation to give handouts, which is what people are calling out for. But a lot of our people are self-sufficient naturally. They do not survive on handouts. They do not want handouts. But because you are not allowed to go and earn a living, or you go and be self-sufficient, then you end up having to fight for these handouts that are not forthcoming. And at the end of the day, you have a lot of theft and robbery that comes up because people cannot take care of themselves. And I think it's counterproductive because the government, no matter how many taxes you collect, you will never be able to take care of everybody in the country. So whether or not people that do vending are taxpayers in the formal way of looking at it, they actually do create self-sufficiency for a greater part of the population, and therefore a lot of revenue that the government raises doesn't have to go to social welfare. It can go to other things like development. And then another thing that I wanted to say, away from criminal laws, is the impact of colonialism on marriage laws. So this is consistent in the whole region. And some countries like Malawi have tried to sort of change the laws to recognize the importance of what the colonialists called the customary law marriage. But if you come from Southern Africa, I come from Zimbabwe, South Africa, most of these countries, a lot of our marriages or unions always come into being through some customary process, whether it's lobola, rowora, whatever you want to call it. But in many of our countries, that customary marriage is not recognized as a marriage. And there's no other reason other than the fact that the colonial state felt that it had to do that. But these laws have continued and these fights have continued, and it's very, very difficult to get these laws to be overturned because they have no rationale. And right now in Zimbabwe, there's a court case that's been filed to challenge the fact that the customary law marriage, which they call a union, is not recognized as a marriage, and therefore because of its non-recognition, parties within the marriage are not beneficiaries of laws that promote just and equitable distribution. And the government is opposing that application. But there's no rationale, because at the end of the day, if that is what the community recognizes as a marriage, then why is it that the law refuses to recognize that as a marriage? And in my view, it's just a colonial hang-up, and it's something that we have to let go.
100%. Thank you so much, Thabo. And it's a very interesting point you raise around the issue of the customary marriages and how, funny enough, we were getting married customarily in any event, and all of a sudden the colonialists told us, no, actually that's not a real marriage, you actually need to sign a paper. And then when you need to get divorced, it's a whole nother story, and you need to go and you know, it's even more complicated than had it been the customary way. So you really do raise a really good point. And just before we round up, we are going to close the meeting at 6:30. I mean, 4:30. At 4:30. So before we round up, I'm going to hand the baton over to Brig. And in the meantime, I'm just going to let Andries, Tawera, and Quenzi think about if they have anything they wanted to add after Brig has spoken. Go ahead, Brig.
Thanks, Amanda. Thabo, so what I said is customary land allows people to be self-sustained. Leave them with their customary land, they will never have problems. They may not have the big houses that we occupy in urban areas, but according to their customs, what they have there is enough. And I was reminded once by a judgment from Eswatini, where someone was saying they were looking at the value of land, and someone was saying, "How come on? Look at that mud house. What is it?" And the court said, "Look, we had treasure in those mud houses. Even polishing them using cow dung, there was value in that." And it's one of the things that I often encounter when I deal with customary land. How do we even evaluate it? Because the current system that deals with assessment of property deals with land market. And you know that customary land from inception was not for sale. And that's why even this thing that many people are facing within families where there are all this property grabbing and stuff like was not common before then, because property was used by the whole community. It's really, you inherit, you occupy, not to sell, but things have changed because of the demand, especially for customary land, which is now almost like the new gold, and we have a new scramble, not for gold, but now for customary land. Now, in our case, when we go out into these areas, while we are challenging some of these customary laws, we do know for sure that there are some progressive laws in these countries we work in. For example, in the Southern Africa, a number of countries have enacted progressive constitutions. And we've also seen that the judiciaries, they have been issuing progressive judgment. And so we know we have this platform. There is some good constitutions. In some countries, they are still lagging in some sections, but not everything. And then we have judges that are, the judiciary that's interpreting those constitutions were giving progressive judgment. So we are going in there. But one of the big problems when we talk about the colonial regions is the thought process, the myth that Anneke has been talking about, and even the power dynamics, not just at the government level. You still have power dynamics in different social sectors. So for example, the people that we represent in the rural community, they are weak. And that's why people are coming and taking over their land. If they were powerful enough, they would actually stand on their own. But when people are taking their land, they would fall back to the colonial laws. There are laws I know in many countries that prohibit taking over land from a widow upon the death of the husband. In some countries, it's even a criminal offense. But these things are happening today because people resort to the colonial rules, say, well, this is our custom. They forget about the law. In fact, of course, not everyone even apply written laws. And then we also come in terms of advocates, for example, raising awareness, because there are certain things when we're talking about practices which are as a result of civic education. Unless people know their rights, they are not going to claim them. There are times even when investors actually go into these countries, depending on who they consult, they may not even understand the rights that the rural communities have. I've stumbled across on paper that say, well, these people have been occupying land for 40 years. However, they do not have recognized legal rights. What do you mean? You have come in here 5 years ago. You acknowledge that this person was occupying this customary land for 40 years, but still you are saying he doesn't have recognized legal rights. So in most cases, it's also civic education on the part of the people who have rights so that they can claim them. And SALC comes in there and helps them do that. On the other hand, again, it helps even those, the perpetrators, to understand that what they are doing is wrong and they are not going to just go scot-free. It's kind of like sending a message that they understand that don't do this. And we also help the countries by clarifying the law, using the constitution and to challenge those old customary law, colonial laws that are still there. Some countries have over 100 or even 300 statutes. Unless someone was to challenge it or there is going to be an issue, it will be seated on the shelf. No one will think about it. There are some laws that maybe government intended to repeal upon getting independence, but they have never been an issue. It's only now when one is going to challenge it. Go and say, I've been living in this land for 50 years, and they'll tell you that it's a forest because during colonial period it was gazetted. Or they tell you that it's a state land which was left by. So colonial rules and practice still pop up, but we do have actually progressive rules. The gap also is just on enforcement and implementation, which I think we are stepping in to bridge that gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brig, and thanks also for highlighting that, you know, there are some laws that are actually progressive, and for highlighting also a lot of the good work that SALC is doing in trying to bridge that gap. And know how much work you are doing, Brig, in country and throughout SADC in terms of women, land and property. And so thank you so much for all your hard work in bridging that gap. I saw Chikondi had a hand up and then the hand went down. So I don't know if you changed your mind or if if you still want to say something.
No, actually, Brig said some of the stuff I wanted to say in respect to awareness. But also, I just wanted to bring to your attention, for those that are familiar with the Wandali case, you know, he was fighting for land ownership for the indigenous Malawians in Cholo and Mmolai. And only this week, there was a mediation in court over some of the land that has been fighting for. And the British owners of the estates, they have given the indigenous Malawians a big part of land which they were not using. But why I was bringing it up was that one guy was arrested, he was put in a mental hospital over this issue. And only now that's when people finally got to get their land. So it just shows how people can actually use the law to infringe on people's rights and even victimize them when they know that they actually deserve what they're fighting for. So he was regarded as a mad person, put in a mental institution. His case is still pending in court in regard to how he was treated at the mental hospital. But these are the dynamics and real issues that affect people when they stand up for what is theirs. And it's clear from what has happened recently that they actually got the land. But also, other thing I wanted to say was maybe we should also reevaluate where we are coming from, where we are, and why we're not moving forward. So I was actually thinking in my mind some sort of a documentary. Actually, in my mind it was animated, where a poor man in the colonial eras still was suffering because of the same laws. And here we are in the 20th century, the same man is still suffering. And then we're looking at why is this man still there? And we highlight those problems as to why we're still there and what can we do about that? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chikondi. And it's a really, really good idea, because we do see that same from 50 years ago, the same sort of suffering that was happening is still happening now. I mean, take it further to 100 or 200 years ago. So I think it's really important for us to ask ourselves, why are things not changing? So that being said, I'm seeing there's some stuff in the chat, but I think Tawera, Andres, and Quincy are okay. I understand Karabo is in the group. I don't know, Karabo, if you have something to say. Sorry, I didn't realize that you were here. Okay.
I think
that's fine then.
Okay.
Oh.
I'm sure Tawera's got something to say.
You know what? The first time this issue was brought about in the staff meeting that we have this discussion on colonial laws, the first thing that came to my mind, I remember there was a time I went, I think it's the Sisonke Gym or something in Cape Town, where then we went to this museum, we were told about this whole issue of 6 week, that you had, I think it was sellers that were coming here, whilst those days prostitution was criminalized, but then they had women they were giving to these sellers to have sex with, because they didn't want them to avoid for these men to sleep with other men. So for me, all that thing came around that these things come from a long time ago. But then yesterday with Anneke, the Communication News Center, now speaking about it. First, I think I look at I think there was a case that SALC did about this power, when we talk about power, giving to the people like the president and stuff. That for me, when I was in Malawi, the time of Kamuzu, we never knew that the power that he held, we never knew where it came from, especially as that being colonized by the British. We thought that was normal. Our parents thought that was normal. So now I think as things are coming up, you have organizations like SALC challenging these laws, then we open our eyes and say, so Richard, this is where it came from. So for me, it's like a big wake-up call, especially at that time of, Malawi, it was bad. The power that they held was like very bad. It was, for us, it was normal. So for me, there was even a time like on social media, I would see people like writing stuff on, really? Should they write this? Isn't this? So for me, you still have that mentality, still hasn't left you. So it's, I think it's a good conversation that we need to be having. The whole issue of tradition, religion, it just comes about a lot. Thank you.
Thanks so much, T. Thanks for that addition. And you did have something to say. So thanks, Anneke, for pushing her, because you actually made some very important points. And even while you're speaking, and just in the last 2 minutes, I think we can round up. I was thinking about, and I think somebody mentioned this, I can't recall who, just the education system that we go through. And I think that also plays a very big role in the impact colonialism has had on us. Because, I mean, I learned about Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus guys, or some cats, and you ask yourself, look, how much are we actually looking at? Why are we not looking at the history of what happened in West Africa and East Africa? And why is our focus so far out, which is so far removed from where we are, so that as a people, or as the next generation, we're able to build and implement laws that speak to our history and not so much Western history. So that being said, if no one else has a hand up, I think we can round up this conversation. I mean, it was such a good conversation. See Anneke telling over this next week. So watch this space. I think some questions that we can leave with is to ask ourselves, how do we tackle these laws? Chikondi did ask that, and paying attention to the political element that is involved is very critical. And I think at SALC, we should just continue to do the work that we are doing and try and realize or find out, look at the source of the problem as to why is it that we are not moving as fast as we would like to be moving with these particular issues, and how can we address that? So, Anneke, I don't know if you have any last closing remarks.
Yes, I know people were hesitant.
We close off the meeting.
I know people were hesitant to have this discussion, and look how interesting it was. I mean, was it not like the best discussion we've had ever in this organization? So I think we have it sort of grounds us, because then when we think about writing about our clusters and why do we do what we do, it shows that we actually do have a whole theory of what needs to happen and what needs to change. And we just actually have to write down those things sometimes. So I'll include bits of this discussion in our strategic plan, just as sort of some of the thoughts that inform us. Suzio wasn't here, Malusi wasn't here, we missed Agnes. So what I will ask is that at the next staff meeting, if they are there, that we just all have a tiny little, where we put our videos on like this. And if anyone then has a minute extra where they want to say something else, I mean, over the weekend you slept on this and you suddenly realize you have the most profound statement to make in a soundbite, then we will have time for that at the staff meeting. And the reason why I think it's important is because we want to put all of this together in a podcast. We want to make sure we hear from all our staff members to say, this is what SALC staff and interns and say about colonial laws, you know, like have like little bits. So if you feel you want something else to add, I think we all have now very nice sound bites from everyone here, but apart from Quincy and Andres, you can either say something now, otherwise keep it for the staff meeting, but we want 1 minute from everyone at least to put in our final podcast. Yes.
Okay, so can I just jump in? Because I don't think I'm going to be thinking about laws on the weekend. My thing is, I'm a finance person, and I really try to kind of think in the way you guys think, but literally, I cannot tell the trees from the woods. Like, for me, it's just, it makes me realize how much you guys, your work is important, right? How I would actually need a lawyer because I wouldn't know what law came from where, because it's just not my background. But it's been an interesting discussion for me. It's educating and informative for me. Thank you so much. And actually, how Tae put it together, how it's a whole system interconnected. I cannot tell what's coming from where, but yeah, I'm really glad I got the chance to learn a few things about law. Thank you.
Thanks, Quincy. And if it makes you feel any better, when I look at an Excel spreadsheet, I cannot tell whether I'm coming or going. So, so I feel you. Andres?
Hi, everyone. Like Quincy said, I also can't tell the trees from the woods or something. But all I'm seeing right now, we're still suffering. We still have the effects of the colonial laws that we are suffering from right now. We still have that gender inequality. The freedom of speech is still the issue right now. Discrimination and laws that are anti-gay, they are still prevalent even today. So thank you.
Thanks, Andries. It sounds to me like you're very much out of the woods and you know exactly what you're talking about.
No,
so thanks for that addition. Thank you for that addition. So thank you so much, guys. Anneke, should I close up?
Yes, please do, because otherwise I can keep this conversation going till 6:30 if people want it.
Yeah.
Stop me now.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for everybody interacting and everybody's thoughts and opinions. I think it went a lot better than all the fear has now been tossed out the window. So we can probably arrange maybe every quarter or something like that to have this type of discussion and, you know, around another topic. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks to those near and afar. And stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.